Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. Again, it's Tuesday, March 18th, 2025 at 1:58 afternoon. It's 2:38. So we're back from a short break and continuing our conversation. There's something.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education. I pulled up on the screen a document to help guide our discussion today. And within this document, we've highlighted key decision points. So at the last meeting, we started to really dig into roles and responsibilities for a CTE governance system and understanding what roles need to be placed within the BOCES, what roles would live within the Agency of Education and the district. The committee had a number of questions, and we reflected on those and brought forward some additional detail within this document. As I noted in our earlier meeting today, we're also very mindful that we're engaging in this work while we're considering the comprehensive education transformation for K-12. And so this document is organized to first identify what we see as the benefits of having a single CTE governance entity. And that would be regardless of governance change for K-12, but just the benefits that we can enumerate based on APA's work over the last 2 years and our involvement with the field. And then what we've identified within the table are looking at roles and responsibilities for the Agency of Education, the CTE BOCES, as we've defined it, and also the CTE centers along with the sending districts. So those are the categories of stakeholders. And then what we've done to the right is identify those roles and responsibilities within our current state. And when I'm defining our current state, I'm assuming our current configuration of 52 supervisory unions, 119 school districts, and also assuming the current tuitioning patterns. Although we would note that any reform should also include funding reform for CTE, regardless of what governance structure may emerge through K-12. And then what we've identified in the next column is how those roles and responsibilities might be adjusted within the 5-district model that's part of the Governor's Education Transformation Plan, and any other future configuration. So we are currently in the process of working with the Senate Education Committee and the House Education Committee on exploring different district configurations, knowing that governance, funding, and quality are all tied together. We're exploring different modeling. We've established a rubric around what things might change within that. So that, I would say, far column is a little bit speculative at this point because there's a lot of unknowns with what alternate configurations or funding may emerge, but at least there, it's kind of a placeholder for us really, because we're thinking about using this as a structure to also, as we're evaluating other configurations, we want to evaluate the impact on CTE. So we can bring this back to your committee and say, there's a configuration of looking at 11 districts and how might that impact CTE, so we can be concrete and specific for your committee, because it is really important to us that CTE reform move forward because it's so central to, I think, all of our goals. So this is our initial thinking. In terms of the benefits, we've discussed many of them already, but it would help to develop a unified vision statewide for priorities around career and technical education. We are fully intending and are working very closely with the State Workforce Development Board and Department of Labor. We want to make sure we're all aligned as we're doing this work together. This would help us to create a statewide federal Perkins plan. That's come up a couple times already in our conversation today. Again, that plan would still customize needs by center, but it allows us to create a more coordinated plan for CTE for the state. It would help us to provide CTE curriculum development and support, along with professional development for our CTE professionals and educators across the state. Provide mentoring and induction support to new CTE educators. We heard that a lot through our planning in the field around that onboarding that's needed for our new educators. The developing career exploration materials. Yeah.
Can I stop just bullet 3, providing CTE curriculum development support. So that would be applicable to all segments.
That would be all. So what we see, what I'm walking through now are the benefits of a CTE unified governance system. This is what we think could come out of that would be positive and beneficial. And to answer your question, it would be supportive of all of the tech centers. Yes. And we've noted in many of our conversations the importance of creating early exposure. So that's a big lift on the K-12 side as we're thinking about career tech. So a single governance part of their responsibility would also be providing that continuity in middle school and developing some of the curriculum and resources that those teachers would be able to implement in the classroom so that they are stackable and it's there's that continuity. Establishing consistent enrollment and admissions policies. We've noted already today that there's a lot of different governance configurations. And so this would remove that complexity. Establishing consistent policies and procedures for data collection and reporting. And, you know, as I've noted several times that we would also need to think about funding reform. So whatever governance comes into play, funding would also need to be consistent within the model. So our first key decision point, and I know had some discussion already around this, are where the CTE center staff are employed. So if they're employed by the district or they're employed by the single governance entity, APA's recommendation is that staff are employed by the BOCES in this model.
When you talk about local districts in your configuration, you're talking about the 5 districts that you in your proposal.
Yes. The single district here is assuming it's kind of agnostic to the benefits of a single district, right? We're layering on top of multiple scenarios. And so what I've walked through are what we think will come out of the benefit of having a single focus on CT. Yes, but the districts that we've outlined here, we have actually looked at it based on the current state, and we have looked at it with the 5 district model and future configurations. But I think just making sure I'm picking up on your question, it's the earlier point within our current state, it becomes more complicated to staff by district. So I would say that would be more untenable.
Do you know of any other states that have a single statewide Perkins plan? Is that like a thing?
Yeah, so yeah, and we can share those examples and we can also share examples of states that have a BOCES as well, because that's the intent is to try to think through this. But I'll ask Ruth and also APA to provide those examples. I know that has been a focus. I don't have prepared with me a reference to which states were used in looking at that, only that it was, I think, something that emerged as a potential benefit given our size as a state, and ability to be more strategic with the funding and supporting professional development, things like that. So as we look at the Agency of Education and looking at roles and responsibilities, the AOE would continue to be responsible for that state level oversight of CTE. So we've talked about that accountability within the monitoring responsibilities, would still be responsible for strengthening program quality and ensuring equity of CTE access. So specifically, the AOE's responsibilities would be monitoring and compliance related to federal and state requirements, conducting site visits to CTE centers, coordinating state-led professional development and technical assistance, providing curriculum development support and credential mapping, completing required data management and data analysis, coordination with post-secondary and workforce partners as appropriate, and teacher licensure. So those are the primary responsibilities that would continue to remain with the Agency of Education. So what we're flagging within the current state, or those are all the same rules, the roles that we have, but we do have less capacity to implement that. I know that capacity issues have been, mentioned several times. Within the 5 district model that's the governor has proposed. Yeah.
Can I go back to that curriculum issue again?
Yes.
When you say providing curriculum development and support, what does that mean? Does that mean establishing the curriculum or something less than that?
Yeah. So the idea is, as you're thinking about implementing a new career and technical education program across centers, that there is consistency in terms of the quality. And so the support would be ensuring the curriculum development and that regardless of center, that there's the same level of quality and expectations.
Just seems a little less than support. It's more direct. It sounds like what you're saying is a little more directive, just support. In other words, the decision maker would be at the AOE level, right, on curriculum.
For curriculum development.
Yeah.
We're looking to provide resources. I think your question is what level of directive is part of that, so I can follow up on that.
Yeah, who's in charge?
So we're talking about the agency's capacity to support CTE, and I understand that there are vacancies in the agency right now that you're looking at how to best hire. But before that, how many of these vacancies were designed to support CTE? So how many positions are we down when we had been supporting CTE before these vacancies?
So for CTE vacancies, it's actually the new position that we're adding, we're recruiting for. But we are staffed up for CTE. I think your question is, in prior years, there had been a larger.
That would be my next question.
Okay, so in prior years, we had a larger CTE team. And I can get you those numbers of what that reduction was over time. There was overall a reduction in the number of agency employees around the time of the recession. And I think that coincided with the changes with CTE, but I can go back and look at staffing numbers to finalize that. Thank you. We are excited to bring on a coordinator, which is a newly created position that we're recruiting for. So within the 5-district model, there is just greater efficiency that's achieved. So when you're
Clarity, which recession were you talking about?
what, 2018 and 2008, 2009, I think it was
Oh,
back then,
Oh, the big major.
the big major. That's my understanding.
Housing
Yeah.
recession.
That's my understanding, but let me go back and clarify to make sure that we're clear on when the reduction occurred, but it's been some time. This was about the same time too that the department moved to an agency. So I think a lot is conflated too during that time as well. So additional, when you think about, I mean, overall, when you think about building capacity, it's the capacity of the entire state system, right? And so we've talked a lot about the complexity of our system creates a lot of duplication of effort and a lot of focus on compliance, streamlining the governance in districts. It does alleviate some of that burden. So I think that would just be kind of across the board as you think about that and being intentional about creating the right expertise at each level. So certainly with fewer districts, there's fewer administrative burden. We would still, APA is still recommending staff in terms of capacity building for the AOE. So I think just a point, and this is going to be consistent, something that we need to be mindful of, the more complexity and kind of the smaller the districts that students are coming from to the CT centers, the more challenging sometimes it can be to manage. So that's just something to think about as we're contemplating support and oversight. So the role of the BOCES is to oversee and coordinate the delivery of CTE in the state through CTE programs offered at the tech center statewide, as well as additional coursework and career exploration at high schools and middle schools. So this would be the responsibility of the BOCES executive director and staff. Those responsibilities are enumerated below. But here's where I would just like to continue to make a plug around really bringing in the right expertise to create that continuum from middle school into the tech centers. And so while the BOCES wouldn't be overseeing the instructors at the middle school or in 9th and 10th grade, there would need to be intentional collaboration. So they're sharing resources and also supporting training for that continuity. So the roles would be distributing funding to the CTE center. So again, that part of the mechanism is that we would have some consistency around budgeting that allows us to do some prioritization in terms of the resources. Also, we've talked about Perkins as part of that. So distributing funding to the tech centers, they would work with the directors to develop center budgets, as components of the overall BOCES budget, enact policies for enrollment and admissions, student information system, CTE calendar, all kind of the HR and oversight of the employees, along with teacher professional development and the induction and mentoring, develop career exploration materials. So that's really supporting that kind of down to the middle school level.
Sorry, can you clarify on that, the career exploration materials? What are we meaning?
So an explicit goal of the policy is to create greater exposure to career and technical education starting in middle school. And so to ensure that that can happen, we want to build on the expertise of the CTE executive director and staff to help develop the curriculum and resources that can be implemented in middle school and also 9th and 10th grade to create that exposure.
Right, so
So it's a resource to the sending districts of providing those courses.
so is that similar to the curriculum development in high school, 9 through 12?
Yeah, and we know that some of our tech centers right now are really doing a fabulous job of working with middle schools and early high school years to promote that connectivity, but we're not seeing that consistently at scale. And so this would allow us to have a consistent middle school career exploration program. And in this framework, the CTE BOCES would be responsible for developing the content because they hold the expertise.
And I guess similar question to what Herb was asking, is that designed to be directive or sort of suggestive?
So I think I want to make sure I can go back to APA with a recommendation specific to CTE. I will say within the K-12 space, it is not directive. It is really being able to increase access to high quality instructional materials and having a process by which we can research and vet those materials and including educator input in that. So that's in the K-12 space. That's how we're really operationalizing the curriculum piece. Within CTE, there are a lot of specifications that are required, in compliance that's different because of Perkins. And so I want to just go back to the team and be clear around the reason we may need to be more directive in that space.
It's, I'm on the same boat as Emily was, those policies. So this seems like a spot where there's a need for alignment between what CTE centers are doing and what the high schools are
Yes.
doing. And I'm wondering if are you going to be coming back to us with a little more specificity about how to handle the need for alignment around a bunch of those issues that were mentioned, I think, in the April.
Yes. Yes. So, and I think that's where within the future state, I can share how we're thinking about that, or within the reform state, the 5-district proposal, we're building in the intention is to resource the central offices with having a liaison to support with that connectivity from the tech centers to the middle school and early high school. So we know that there needs to be a tight and coordinated working relationship. So similar to pre-K, right? Part of the idea of being able to have a more robust central office is that you can have support for these specific content areas. And we would envision that the districts would have a liaison for career and technical education that would be interfacing with the tech centers in addition to the superintendent and the principals.
Yeah, in answer to your question, yeah, I'm thinking about, what's the governor's proposal. And so, we have the CTE coaches and then we have 5 districts. And maybe you don't want clarity, but in my mind, it's always important, who's in charge. So you got liaisons and, you try to coordinate stuff. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone who can, work out disagreements and say, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And so what the governor's proposal is around that kind of alignment would be helpful to know, to me.
Yes. So we can, from the funding perspective, we've been intentional around creating, ensuring that there are the resources to create that alignment, right? That there's that staff capability, and that there's the ability to fund additional teachers at the middle school and level and 9th and 12th grade level to actually be able to deliver. We also, within the funding, as I've shared or I've communicated, is really thinking about the shared ownership and support for that student. So there is intentionality with this proposal around keeping some of the dollars at the district, understanding that there's some additional support and coordination for that child's education, and making sure that there's a very a good amount that's going to the tech center to operate high quality programs. I think there's further conversations as we're talking about quality and consistency, and really thinking about if it's, to your point, it's great to collaborate, but what is the state requirement for creating that middle school programming, right? And so, for example, and so I have flagged it, that's likely something within kind of education quality standards that we would want to look at if we want every child to be able to benefit from a middle school further inspiration program. That might be something we consider and putting into quality standard.
Just to follow up, so, but that, do I assume what you're saying is that those changes to the quality standards would happen after legislation? In other words, guidance on that wouldn't be, what do you envision? You know, guidance around those kinds of alignment issues in the legislation, or something that would take place afterwards?
I think there should be intentionality now around what we're trying to achieve. And so, you know, there's a lot of flexibility with the funding proposal. And so if there's intention around, you know, career and technical education, which I know is part of our explicit goal around having opportunities in middle school, I think that would be made more explicit. Also, still sticking with the BOCES, we did keep the managing the central systems for contracting here. I know that continued to be a question if that made more sense within the districts. I think that this is really a recommendation of APA in thinking about creating that alignment. We also are working with a CTE policy sprint team, and we will be publishing some of our findings from that. So I'm not sure if this particular area came up as a question, but I would welcome that further conversation with you when we have really summarized those considerations. I think those are questions that the field can help us to sort through.
I think when we talk about those, you know, HR pieces, statewide contracts, talking about payroll, things like that. I mean, does it make sense that even for 5 districts, that each one has that, or should there be one system for the state? I mean, we do it in state government. Everything goes into one centralized area to pay people, that type of thing. Why wouldn't we be thinking about a system same way? Not, even though we're saving money, still individualizing districts. It makes sense to me, I guess.
I think you can see that there are a lot of the questions that we're calling out here that are decision points. So, and there's also, again, acknowledgement as we're looking at these recommendations, it's sometimes challenging because the recommendations are kind of thinking within our current system and thinking about the reform system with 5 districts. And so I think you're rightly pointing out those questions, and those are really important decision points. So, you know, I think we have noted that here is a centralized system for the tech centers, or should that be managed through the district? You know, what conversations are we having around kind of statewide infrastructure improvements as part of the transformation? I think some of those questions will be answered as we think about those mechanics and land on the final in a future state, because it does create a really important opportunity to migrate to systems that are going to be high quality and achieve scale. any sort of change in district configuration would need to contemplate system integration. So I think this is the right time to have that discussion. And leave it there because that's kind of part of the challenge of drafting this as we're drafting the other piece. Just trying to think, I think we've actually gone through a lot of the decision points. I think the one follow-up question is regarding really how directive and how much flexibility. I think that's something I want to refer back to our experts, just because the CTE world is very different in terms of the compliance requirements to Perkins. So I want to make sure I give you a clear answer on that recommendation. We also have some other decision points around responsibility for things like transportation, knowing that there's still coordination required. I think a lot of these decision points will also have to do with kind of how the funding is distributed within the model. And I think I'm just looking at the other decision points to see.
Sorry, so just
Yeah.
questions on the Perkins and transportation. Is transportation bound up in the various Perkins proposals, or is that something totally separate?
So I'll share, we've been having a lot of broader conversations around transportation and understanding how to appropriately fund transportation. And I want to give you the answer around within the grants. I'm not sure what portion might be allocated towards Perkins, but I do know within the base funding amount, within the categorical grant funding amount, we are really assuming additional transportation costs, because right now we reimburse at 50%. But for Perkins specifically, 50% of the transportation cost. So we have kind of a placeholder right now for transportation. And assuming that if we're going to kind of require that transportation happen, how does the state fund that? The modeling will need to be done around like different routes and, you know, kind of going down the weeds and the operations of transportation. But to answer your question, I need to go back and see kind of how transportation is represented within the grants.
Thank you.
And Ruth would have that. Okay, and then the tech centers, they'll continue to be led by site-based directors. They oversee all center programs, all the service delivery for students. They oversee all of the center-based staff. They would be managing their center budgets. There would be some coordination overall with budgeting across the centers through the BOCES, but they would manage theirs. They would contribute to the coordinated Perkins plan that allows for us to have that customization where needed, manage local partnerships and opportunities for students, and coordinating transportation with the BOCES. So we do have the tech centers within this responsible coordinating, but I think the question is the funding piece that I can follow up with.
So on budgeting, I think you say managing center budgets, who would actually approve or establish center budget? I mean, aside from elections and things, total approval, would that be at the BOCES?
The BOCES would be coordinating with the tech centers to develop the budgets. Yes,
Well, I guess my
the
question.
BOCES would be approving the budgets.
Thank you.
So in each center, who is there besides the director to help develop that budget that goes to the BOCES?
I think the question, just to make sure I'm clear, is what's the process for gathering input from the community and developing your budget? And that is assumed to be part of the process. And I know we've identified as part of the transformation plan, ensuring that there are a certain number of hearings as well to provide input on budget development. Specific to CTE, I can get additional detail around how that might be different or what additional input might be required.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, are we gonna jettison the RAB? Or are we gonna utilize the RAB and give the RAB more duties and maybe a little more power than they have now to help develop those I guess figure out what the budgets are gonna be, working with the director. Or do you visualize BOCES somebody from BOCES working with the director to develop budget, then that goes to the BOCES board.
Yeah, I think what I would share is that we need to add that kind of stakeholder group to this overarching roles and responsibilities. I know we have had some conversations around governance and discussion around moving kind of a statewide in a way, because we know that there's sometimes really challenges in terms of ability for experts to be part of that. I know there's been conversations around how do we make sure that that work is meaningful, right? And we know examples of where that's working really well. So I think that's a follow-up to really clarify the role of the board to support in a meaningful way.
Thinking through the comprehensive learning needs assessments at the CTE center level, I can presume then that the 5 district model has within it the capacity to handle multiple CLNAs per district for those that would have multiple CTEs in them.
So I think the question, let me make sure I'm understanding your question, is will there be is the question, is there intentionality around how we are identifying the regional workforce needs and then customizing by community, or?
Well, I think this is a great chance for me to learn a little more.
Okay.
We envision the comprehensive learning needs assessment taking place at each of the 5 districts, at each of the specific CTE centers? Like, what is the unit what is the local that is being described there?
And I think Ruth was talking about this at the last session we attended, in terms of that process is quite cumbersome too, right? And the idea of going to, I think the intention around having one Perkins plan is really being able to streamline that process and thinking about some of the statewide needs. But we also know that they need to be customized by locality. So,
and there's one CLNA per Perkins plan is kind of the thought. Is that what I'm?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. There's the simple. And so, yes, the thought is how it's flexible for the many different partnerships that may exist between local employers and what CTEs are offering, et cetera. So I guess, but as you said, they're part of the decision points, and those things I guess need to be thought through.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So another effort, I mean, as a small state, there's an opportunity for us to kind of think statewide around the needs and then to customize. But I would let, you're definitely getting the B team on this. So I will make sure that I follow up with Ruth to ensure that I've answered that precisely.
Thank you.
One follow-up on this. We've been talking about reporting, and we've been talking about the agency having multiple different systems where you gather data on different things. I don't know how that impacts tech, but I do know that the systems don't talk well to each other and aren't easy to work together. Is any of this re-envisioning also re-envisioning the data collection points and how they work together? Yeah.
We just actually provided testimony around the different systems and our efforts to improve data collection. And so as you think about, there was some conversation several years back on moving to one student information system. And there was work with the field and providing input on the best path forward. And then what the recommendation was to allow flexibility for multiple systems, but ensuring certain requirements were met. And then the agency was developing a process which is called EdFi, which is kind of used, like, kind of describe it as a vacuum to kind of collect all of the data, clean it and normalize it for reporting. So I think the question becomes, to what extent is that needed versus true system alignment? I think there is some further diagnosis around that across all of our systems that needs to be done and with the field.
So there's no plan, but it is noted as something that is still necessary.
So there is a plan for evaluating the existing systems as part of the transition process, and recognizing that there will be system integration needs in transitioning to larger districts. And as part of that process, the agency also needs to ensure that we're creating that alignment. There are a couple of contracts that we're looking at currently. For example, FI is one example that expires in 2 years, right? And so, yes, we are thinking about that as part of the transition. But that takes some time, and that's work though that we're aware needs to be done. Evaluating.
So I may have missed it somewhere. But in terms of, you have a bunch of different entities that are being assigned roles and responsibilities here. And I may have missed it. Has there been any sort of budget pro forma being put together around? I mean, a lot of things are being got under the governance. I'm just looking at the governance program. And a lot of things are shifting. I would assume, or shouldn't assume. You have a budget, draft, high level kind of budget of what would be required to fulfill these roles and responsibilities, and how it changes from, well, no, just how what the budget would be for the different entities. The level of specificity. I know that you're working with Mr. Levinson, and when he dealt with our kind of configuration, which is much smaller scale, he was able to put together some fairly good analysis, both written material as well as spreadsheets that shows, here's where these positions would change. This is what it would cost. It also specified, well, here are the savings, that you can expect that would help fund some of the changes that were being proposed. Do you have something like that, or is that something that we can use for?
I think we have part of that we can satisfy now. So may have been a month ago, we did ask the K-12 Solutions with Nate Levinson to take our funding model and develop a budget, a prototypical budget, assuming operating within the 5-district model, to identify the flexibility and how you can prioritize based on the goals of the board and the superintendent. We received questions to refine that further, specifically in recognition that salaries are different across the state in different regions, and that there was a need to be more precise with what would be possible within those budgets, assuming that there are going to be higher salaries currently that we're starting from in certain areas. So we will be sharing district budgets for each of the 5 districts, and we'll articulate the priorities that were defined within the budgeting process. There's a lot of different ways that you could budget. As I said, there's some flexibility, but I think that might be a helpful resource in getting more concrete. We were kind of working on a prototypical, and so we're using state averages, which gives us some information. But I think actually drilling down and being able to do budgeting within the 5 districts provides a different level of clarity and insight into how it would be operationalized.
And has he worked on something like that for CTE, under the CTE?
So he's worked on that as part of, yes, so part of that is assuming also the CTEs within that budget framework.
So that's forthcoming, or is that
Yes.
already exist?
There's a prototypical budget was developed that was inclusive of CTE, but we will be sharing very soon the 5 district budgets that we put together.
Is there a document that I should look at? Should I wait?
I'll share the first version
Okay.
that we put together, and then we'll have more details with the 5 district model.
Okay.
I think that satisfies some of your question, but not all of your question, because I think you're also looking at comparing it to existing staffing, which
Yeah, savings, right? I suppose.
Off of that point, is the CTE the plan does it only get funded with Perkins dollars, or general fund dollars put in there too?
no, within the model, we also have funding that's built in for CTE, both in the
Wait, from Perkins or?
So we receive Perkins funds.
Yeah.
And then there's additional dollars within the funding proposal that's included in the base for middle school and 9th and 12th, and then there's additional funding for the tech centers.
Okay, when you say the funding proposal, that's
Ed fund.
the larger ed fund.
Costly to operate.
Okay, of course it is.
And then the sending districts, we've outlined that, providing counseling services, coordinating special education, English language services, providing access to extracurriculars, athletics, granting high school diplomas, and then working with the BOCES, not just to coordinate transportation of students, but overall coordination. There's a longer list of the types of areas they would coordinate. And again, as we thought about the proposal with the funding is really allotting the funding for the districts to support with these responsibilities. That was what put together today. And the intent of kind of pulling this all together is to really identify the areas where we do need to make some clear decision points. So in areas where you may have further questions that we can follow up on and come back with additional recommendations. Oh, yes, that was provided in the APA report. There's a full funding analysis that goes into cost per pupil. It also analyzes cost relative to different tech centers and cost relative to quality. And based on that analysis, the APA did recommend the funding that was proposed in the governor's plan. That report was shared, or we can,
Yeah.
okay. I can't remember what page number it is, but in the appendix to the motion data tables.
They look at who owns buildings, who owns equipment. Any estimates of what leases might look like. Because I think in order to get that full per pupil cost and whatever the block grant's going to be per pupil, we need to understand all of those background costs too, and hopefully there's enough left to educate the child.
Yes, so we have noted that the question, it is on our list to be able to produce that analysis. Managing the debt service has come up, as you would expect in the conversation, not just for the tech centers, but overall for the K-12 transformation. Yes. I don't have that with me today, but we are working on that. Okay.
When do you think would be a good time to bring you back in? With Ruth and maybe APA, I think we'd really like to delve deeper into OCs, because I think probably one of the first things we should decide on is, are we going with the BOCES model, or do we want to go with the single district model? And it might be good to have everybody so that we can really understand those pros and cons and decide.
Agreed. I think for the intention today was at least for me to be able to come back and respond to the direct request that you had. The Fuller team was not available today to dive into some of the specifics that you're looking for. So I think next week would be the earliest time, just because of the timing around the conference for Ruth and availability of the team. We're also coordinating really deeply with Department of Labor on some specifics. And so I would appreciate the time for us to continue that coordination this week so we can be prepared to address your questions with more detail. I certainly today was prepared with a very high level, but we need to have a deeper dive in these areas. And so next week, I think middle to end of next week would be a good time for the team to come back.
Why don't we just for now, let's look at Wednesday all morning. I think our afternoons next week are going to be pretty well filled up. And even this week, I don't know how much time we're going to have. So I think Wednesday, Thursday morning At times where we can really devote, maybe figure both mornings, I think.
And so that I'm clear in being able to prioritize our work. It sounds like the real question is understanding the governance options, BOCES versus districts, and being able to clearly articulate the differences and the pros and cons. Sounds like that's
Yeah, and I think once we've settled on where, what that governance looks like, and I think we can move forward with everything else.
And then I did note also just some specific questions around funding, around what's in the Perkins grants specifically. So that's very easy for us to be able to turn around. I don't have that with me today. And then another, I think, outstanding question from our conversation is the curriculum development and really how prescriptive that is within this for CT specifically.
And staffing numbers from the agency for CTE, what does it take to really support a robust CTE?
You mean when when it was staffed at a higher level?
Understanding what has been pushed into the localities from the agency, and does that right, as we're setting, if we can set up one governance model, right, that's our plan. There probably is a better way to do it centralized, some of these things. So what are these?
I always say having the right expertise at the right level of the system. And I think that's what your question is really driving at. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you leaving?
I was planning to.
Fast enough.
I'm already late for my next meeting, so I can stay.
No, I just wanted to chat with you for.
Yes, I can chat with you. Just teasing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations to Ruth.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I got the name of the award. It's everyone knows for the record what she's being recognized for. It is the Heart and Hope Award from the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity. Right?
Nice.
Yeah, so we're very proud of her. I think my purse is somewhere. Okay.
Just before.
Commissioner, how are you?
Good afternoon. Kendall Smith, Deputy Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Labor. I will likely be much more brief than Secretary Saunders in that, as she mentioned a few times, we are collaborating. So I had seen everything she put up on the screen before it was there, and the agency really is the lead and the expertise in terms of how to functionally do a lot of this, with us though kind of being the backup and trying to help provide more context for how this fits into our overall workforce system, and a couple other opportunities to leverage partnerships with other entities. So reflecting back, I guess, on some of the things that I heard over the past 2 hours, and when I was thinking, how can I add value to the conversation we've had so far today, given where the committee's gone and what Secretary Saunders shared, is as I look at this from the Department of Labor, I'm thinking, regardless if we go with the language that the committee's introduced, or Secretary Saunders had mentioned that we were working on some of our own language that they're happy to share, do we start from scratch? What are the principles that are important to at least the Department of Labor in terms of what success could look like, or how are we measuring, are we hitting the mark in terms of these specific versus prescriptive language around, like, we're going to die on the hill of specific wording or terminology. Sorry, I'll just pause for a second. What do you guys?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Has to
Yeah.
go to another committee.
Yes. And so those for the Department of Labor that I was able to write down as we were sitting here, and things that we talk a lot about internally and I share with the Agency of Education, and this is kind of a rough order, but would be number one, and this came through in a lot of the conversations so far, increasing access to career technical education, both for high school students, middle school students, adult students, across the entire spectrum, and really elevating career technical education so that it's not an afterthought or an add-on, that it's a co-equal with traditional high school in terms of the pathways that our students are choosing. That would be our priority number one. does the system that you all, or the changes that you all pursue in this committee, meet that first objective? The second objective for us, which again has been a big theme throughout the conversation today, would be the consistency of the programming, the quality of that programming statewide, and knowing that the program is aligned with our current workforce needs, as also being anticipatory to what's coming down the pike. My 7-year-old daughter, the job that she's probably going to have doesn't exist yet, as the economy and the world changes. So how are we being on the forefront of that? You know, what do our regional communities, our regional businesses need, but also how are we doing that forecasting in terms of what our students going to need 5, 10, 15 years from now? I actually didn't have this in my notes, but the other piece of that would be how are we integrating in our programming soft skill development? I'm not going to say that necessarily needs to be called out in your legislation, but as I speak with employers in my role every day, I will train people. I need a body. I need them to show up on time. I need them to know how to communicate clearly. I need them to be adaptable. It's those soft skills, those evergreen skills versus they need to have a degree in chemistry or they need to have a degree in XYZ. It's really like, can they learn? Can they adapt? Can they communicate? Can they show up? That's something that can maybe just be weaved and woven throughout programming. The third kind of principal priority would be the ease of partners to connect in with the system. So whether that is the Department of Labor, whether that is other workforce and training programs that are working with the same youth. I think about Vermont Works for Women. I think about Resource. I think about all the partners in the Serve, Earn, Learn Collaborative, generally speaking, and I'm sure there's others statewide. How are they able to connect in both with the CTE centers and the traditional high schools in terms of the opportunities that they are providing and have an easy way for the schools to kind of do a checkup on the quality, whether they're going to be credit-bearing experiences or how are we interacting with other partner organizations that are serving, again, our same youth. The fourth, again, kind of principle or goal is one that my counterpart, Jay Ramsey, really provided a vision for when we were last here, which is creating that through thread to adult education and training. I'm saying that with a small a, small e, but we were talking about last time we were here, how potentially a phase 2 of that work. And we heard from some of the adult education providers this morning, which are really good partners, in terms of maybe the need to stabilize that system for the coming year. But what do we do once we kind of get our arms around pre-K through 12 to really transform from cradle through career? So we're serving Vermonters at any stage of their professional development through our CTE centers or our education and training programming. So creating that through thread. And then the fifth one is in terms of, again, what does the language look like? Is it clear what role CTE is playing in our larger workforce system? We may not be able to fully articulate that question with 100% consensus, but understanding what is CTE doing compared to other programs, resources, et cetera, that exist for learners. So again, I don't know if the committee has done, and I don't want it to become a rabbit hole, but any kind of similar exercise in terms of what are your principles as you're comparing what the administration is bringing forward versus what you might be crafting yourself versus what are the various stakeholders going to be testifying to and sharing in terms of what are the top kind of 4 or 5 measures of success that the committee can agree on. So that might be a way to anchor the conversation and the language drafting going forward. My other kind of observation or question, and Representative Karis Duncan was hitting on it, which was when Secretary Saunders was just talking about CTE, it's a very specific definition of CTE and experience, but I heard there's a lot of interest in work-based learning, career-connected learning, other kind of career exploration opportunities at all grades. And so right now, there's not necessarily consistency statewide in terms of if every school has a work-based learning coordinator, for example. Barry at Spalding, Michelle LaFrancis is a phenomenal work-based learning coordinator, but I don't know if a Michelle LaFrancis exists in every high school across the state. And so that might be a question that's a little bit it's again, it goes back to how does this fit into the larger education transformation conversation? If we're going to make larger changes or if we're just doing CTE and what levers are we pulling? Are we pulling governance? Are we pulling finance? Yes or no? But I would also encourage the committee to think expansively and be kind of maybe have a discussion about what does college and career readiness mean to you in terms of the way that you want to define this programming and grapple with this programming, either in the current state or a reform state. Let me see, what else did I have here in my notes? I guess the only other thing, or one of the only other things, and I can connect with Secretary Saunders after too, when we come back next Wednesday, Thursday. Maybe if it was, we were creating some sort of, potentially with the help of Ledge Council, who is not in the room, but almost like a side-by-side in terms of here is what we have laid out in the administration's proposal, and in my mind, how it hits these principles. Here is what the committee bill that you introduced last week, what that looks like compared as a side-by-side with some of those decision points. That has been a lot of times an effective way for committees to move conversations forward. If something like that might be a good resource for us to create together. I think those were my key takeaways. Again, like I said at the outset, we're working really closely with the Agency of Education. And so Secretary Saunders really provided the meat and potatoes of this. And we're trying to create that nexus to, again, the workforce system. How does this fit in? What are the other partners that are important to be communicating with and making sure that they have, again, a easy entrance into the system. But I'd be happy if you guys have questions for me today to have more discussion.
Questions for the deputy commissioner?
So, sort of made a list of what problems we've heard around CP, and one of them, I think I heard either from the APA report or maybe some other sources, was the degree coordination between CTEs and workforce training programs. In some places it was pretty good, in some places it wasn't pretty good, or it wasn't consistent.
Right.
Whether you see any value in trying to identify that as an area to at least adjust in some way in legislation, or not ready for that.
So what was the specific nexus point? It was, you said the quality of the programming or?
No, I think more the coordination between CTEs
And
workforce training program.
and other workforce training programs. I'm not sure. So how I had tried to articulate that as a priority was trying to make it, I'm saying easier. I don't know if that is the right word. So here's an anecdote that maybe, and tell me if this is what you're thinking of or not. I recently heard from a workforce training provider that they want their programs to be credit bearing with schools through flexible pathways. That's outside of CTEs. And what they have to do in order to do that is go school to school, which is going to take them forever if they want to do that in every single school. And so I don't know what the right structure necessarily looks like. I do think it is either this single district, or if you're thinking about the broader, again, education governance conversation, if it's 5 districts or something less, if that could be handled at the district level versus them having to go school to school to school to school to school forever, because again, it's going to take a long time. There has to be, that's why I say easier, like an easier glide path to have those types of conversations. If there are other education or training providers that are offering a quality program that we could recognize for credit and then have that be, to your point, consistent statewide. So it's not, oh, we accept it in Southern Vermont, but we don't accept it in Northern Vermont.
Yeah, that's an example of the type of issue. Information.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'll have it on, and you don't have to answer this, but I'll sort of have it on my list of, that's a problem. And if we're dealing with CT, maybe that's something we can address.
It's not really a question, more of a comment, which is just that I appreciate your discussions, sort of the soft skills required and sort of adaptability and ability to show up. I know in my business and what I hear from other employers is soft skills over hard skills any day. And so
Yes.
I think that is really important, and we get, I think, really caught up in teaching skills, these sort of technical skills
Mhm.
for employment. And just, it's really just a comment that I
Yeah.
appreciate you highlighting that. And I think that is something that we shouldn't forget.
I agree. This is probably in that phase 2 type of conversation when we're talking about adult learners, but there's a big shift right now with employers to move towards skill-based hiring more than qualifications. So even state of Vermont as an employer in certain instances is starting to remove the bachelor's degree requirement from certain job postings. And as it relates to I hope higher education is paying attention to that, because if there's still graduating students with lots of debt and you don't actually have to show that you have a bachelor's degree for a job anymore, that value proposition for higher education is going to need to shift. And so I think, though, that's one of those opportunities, though, I think, for, again, whether we're talking about CTE, work-based learning, or adult education and training programs, to almost be seizing in terms of, and I love higher education. This is not, an indictment of that system at all, but to be saying, hey, like, there are lots and lots of great jobs here in Vermont, and we can give you the soft and the hard skills that you need to get your foot in the door without necessarily taking on that additional debt. And it's a shift. We were talking about this a little bit last time we were here in terms of how people want to learn and want to be education consumers, in terms of maybe doing it in like stackable credential type models. A little bit at a time, we were talking about serve and learn models. But
On that topic, that actually
Mhm.
had me thinking, from the Department of Labor's perspective, are there measurable outcomes with soft skills? And how do we know? It seems like other definitions, I know it when I see it. I
yeah,
know it when I'm missing it, like from an
Right.
educational perspective.
right.
Can I redirect that just a little bit? We have proficiency-based graduation requirements in Vermont right now, and so perhaps it's a question for the Department of Labor to work with the agency of education on what would proficiency in some of these skills look like, and how do we roll that out? About that might be,
That's
if it's not reframing what you were thinking, that's the path.
So that's actually a topic I've been exploring in the after school and summer program space, where what role can after school and summer programs be playing too in soft skill development and helping you translate experiences that you wouldn't necessarily think of, let's say, communication experiences, to be able to show you have that skill. So let's say you're in a art club and then you have to stand up though and present your artwork. Like, you're thinking like, oh, I've somehow mastered art, but at the same time, if you're doing an oral presentation about your art, maybe you're mastering communication at the same time. And so other states have a strong kind of like skills badge culture that we don't actually really have here in Vermont. But it's again, it's been an area that I've been having exploratory conversations in, because the thing is, we could absolutely with partners develop something like skills badges, but the next phase would be having that employers recognize, right? Like the value in that skills badge, those value recognized, say credentials, and how do we make sure there's an actual market for it if we're going to create those proficiency recognitions that employers will be like, oh, I recognize that this, again, I'm say badge, like badge that the YMCA awarded you or 4-H awarded you or whoever awarded you is going to, lead to me knowing you have some communication skill or mastery. But
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate that. We appreciate that the departments are working together.
yes.
Look forward to continuing the conversation.
We'll be back on Wednesday or Thursday with the Agency of Education, and we'll follow up with Secretary Saunders on some of the questions you asked her. If there's anything that you want really specifically from us, obviously reach out and we'll make sure to incorporate that into the materials. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to have to leave around 4, so I'll stay for another 15 minutes or so. Thanks.
Thank you. Jody, you've been with us all day. And then just before I go to you, for folks who are still on the agenda, if you can come back in the morning, you might get fresher brains from me. And our schedule is pretty open, so if you want to come in, we can stay, I think, until 4:15-ish, 4:30 today, so if folks can only be here today. Coordinate with Anna Grace and she'll coordinate back to me. If you can come back in the morning, then that's another option. So, Jody, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Thank you for your patience with us today.
Thank you for allowing me to run out and do my staff meeting for a half hour and come back and still be going. I really appreciated that. I know I missed some things that I might want to respond to, but I know there's a couple people in the room that are on the list. If they can't, I could come back tomorrow if they can't. So I just want to give space for that.
So,
I can't tomorrow, I'm teaching new principal.
And I can come tomorrow.
and then, if you're okay with it, Jody, then I'll bring Jay up and
I'll
Great.
stick around just in case there's a few minutes, but I'll give my space to Jay and then I'll come back tomorrow.
I'll be quick.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Been a long day. Good, I wasn't even trying to be funny. I usually try to be fun. Good afternoon, everybody. Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. As I'm looking at the proposed bill, I'm trying to look at it from a statewide perspective and in concert with other governance and educational funding concepts. I'm looking at draft 2.1 of the CTE bill. Hopefully you're still there. I haven't seen any testimony, I think, yet today. The CTE directors asked me to facilitate a meeting with them recently in which we discussed a number of policy constructs, some of which are included in your bill. So I'm going to touch on those a little bit. It's clear to me that after meeting with the CTE Career Center directors, that their preferred path forward in regards to governance would be, and I underline this in my testimony, to keep things as they are until decisions have been made at the state level as to the number, composition, and geographical boundaries of school districts in general. I believe and I can talk more about that. I believe the CTE directors fully understand changes coming. Further, it's my conclusion that they are supportive of any changes that will result in better opportunities, efficiencies, and programming for students. These are caring leaders who really want to provide the best for the students they serve. It's also clear to me that if the CTE directors had to make a forced selection choice now between being 1, wrapped into 5 districts proposed by the governor's transformation plan, or 2, becoming essentially under the governance of the Agency of Education, the majority of them would prefer choice either 3, to become a CTE district of their own, which this bill proposes, or have 3 CTE districts in the state, a South, a Chittenden County one, and a North one, as they also talked about. However, again, it's important to note that while they're not completely opposed to the last 2 constructs, they strongly believe seeing how the rest of the governance structure of K-12 education comes to fruition is paramount before finalizing CTE governance decisions. That's the main message I want to convey today. In full disclosure, I agree with them and support that position. I do want to publicly say again, I think I said this committee, I know I've said it with others, that the ultimate best path forward from my perspective is to have larger high schools with comprehensive programs that include career and technical centers. But I don't see an easy path there anytime soon. So any governance structure that we build that ultimately gets us eventually to that model, I think will be best for the state's high school students in the long run. Obviously, that would involve construction costs and the closing of some high schools and the building of newer and fewer high schools. And I know that won't happen easily. That's going to take time. The rest of my testimony will be brief commentary on the tenets of the bill itself. Full disclosure, I did this at 6:30 this morning, so if there's typos, I apologize. Section 2, you talked about 15 service regions described in the bill. That makes sense to me. As far as I can tell, it's consistent with the delivery model in place today. I think it's pretty much the exact same thing. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, it's a placeholder because it's what we have today.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. And of course, if the service regions are under one district umbrella, options for students and other service regions would be easier to accomplish. I'll give you an example. If I'm at the Coal Hollow Career Center and their forestry program is full and there's room at the forestry program in St. Albans, it would be easy if they were all the same district. Same true if that was the North District. So there are some advantages what you're talking about here. 2-year terms, I wrote first, you need to find a way to stagger this, then I looked again and saw that you actually did. As we don't want a lot of board turnover, so you address it later in the proposal. I think you have half the board serving for 1 year and the other, that's great. We want something along those lines. I do question about the superintendents of each region would have to come to agreement on who would serve on the new statewide board. That could be difficult. There's gonna be a lot of advocacy. I know if I was a superintendent, I would be pushing to make sure I had a board member from my system that was on that board. So that may need some discussion on what that would exactly look like. Maybe you lock those 4 or 5 superintendents in the room and say, you don't come out, you, how about you agree on a board member? Credits and grades earned, this one's really important to me and to the VPA. We completely agree with this language. We think CTE courses approved by the agency for credit in the content area needs to be accepted by the home school districts towards attainment of diplomas. There are issues or questions about rigor. The homeschool district and the CTE service area and or CTE district, depending on where you end up, can collectively work on these issues with the agency of education being the final arbiter. Every year I get phone calls from a principal on one end and a CTE director or CTE superintendent on the other end, arguing about whether or not a kid should be able to graduate because this should count as a math class and not a science class or vice versa. We need to get rid of that stuff. We need to have it be clear up front that if I'm taking this class, I'm getting credit for whatever it is, and then hold to that so that a kid is not put in a situation where they're halfway through their senior year and they're all of a sudden thinking, oh my gosh, I might not graduate. And every year we get a few of those. We need to get rid of that. Major issues not addressed unless I missed it, and then I'll answer any questions you might have. Common statewide calendar. I realize this is being worked on other places. This is needed for student offerings and professional learning for educators, including content like CTE educators. If you come up with a calendar that's left at the whim of districts as it has been in the past, there's issues around when professional learning days are taken. There's issues around when schools are doing exams. And so if I'm a kid who's at the CTE center in the morning and I'm at the local high school in the afternoon, an exam schedule doesn't line up, do I go to school? Do I not go to school? A lot of learning gets lost that way. So the more we can streamline that, and I hate to say it, but I think it's going to be the General Assembly that ultimately does that. Superintendents, we tried for years. I know there's a proposal out there right now. We'll see how that works. But I think if you can have one consistent calendar, this is the Vermont school calendar, you're better off. People will not like it. You're going to get lots of complaints about it. But I think after a couple of years, people will be used to it, and that's the way that it will be. Funding, I know that is to be determined. To the degree possible, CTE directors and high school principals want to make sure there's a way to eliminate competitive funding so that neither host districts nor CTEs are working at cross purposes when it comes to attracting students. And if we have a little bit bigger scale, I think that will help with that. As long as it's not just the CTEs at the bigger scale, we also have the bigger scale for the public education system. Infrastructure, this will need to be addressed at a statewide level in the not too far future. There are a lot of high schools that are in bad shape, and there are some CTE buildings that should be knocked over and rebuilt or moved. Some of our access problems can be addressed with construction and enabling programming where wait lists are common today to get rid of that. And serving students, I'm not sure really how the one CTE district model is necessarily going to lead to service for more students, at least not at the level I would like to see it. My hope is that eventually we get to the point that we have no waiting lists and that every student gets into the program they're interested in. And that's not really addressed here. I do think having a more streamlined governance system can help with that. There's still going to be issues around transportation, how far away it is from one building to another. The more we can break those barriers down and have more opportunities for kids. In Vermont, about half of our kids go on to college, about half don't, and that's okay. You know, we have a lot of states have a lot more percentage of kids that go to college that don't necessarily finish. I would rather have a kid go into the trades, get a high-paying, high-quality job in service of an area that we need, plumbing, electricity, and those types of things that they're really interested in, than go like my oldest son did and become a PE teacher. And he went for a year and got $30,000 worth of debt, and then now he sells Kentworth tractor trailer trucks. So I'm not really sure how that money that he paid to Barry University really helped his future. But you know, college is not for every kid, and that's okay. But what we do want to make sure is that every kid has either the opportunity to go to college or to go to some type of credentialing program that can lead them to a high value job in our economy that's going to help them be positive contributing members to our society and have them be taxpayers that will have kids and that will live in Vermont. open to any questions,
Anybody have questions for Jay?
sir.
Why haven't we just legislatively done the standard schedule?
Statewide calendar?
Yeah.
Wow. So I think part of it's political will. I think part of it is everybody agrees that we should have a regular calendar, but it should be the calendar that we have in our region right now. So when we were working on this, the last time we worked on this really superintendents, when I was a superintendent, there were the trustees all sit down in the room and we said, let's figure this out. And I came forward with the calendar that Elaine Pickney and I had created. She was the superintendent of Champlain Valley a while back. And we put it out there. And the superintendent of Rutland, who's no longer there, who I love, Mary Moran, she said, Rutland 100% supports this concept of a statewide calendar as long as it's our calendar. That kind of ended the meeting. People could not, even the 15 superintendents that were in the room could not agree on a common calendar. We came up with a calendar, it's called Calendar 2.0. I don't know how many of you remember that? I went around the state advertising that. I got booed in St. Albans, the area where I live in. I got arrows in the back everywhere I went. And it really was 8 weeks on, 2 weeks off, full school year. July would be the summer vacation. It was all based on research.
Yeah, all right.
It was all based on what was best for kids learning, and places that had implemented it, places in Colorado and California, teachers were all like, we will never go back to the crazy calendar we have now, where teachers are going 100 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden, boom, you got this break. And then this calendar, what would happen for 8 weeks, you'd have education. Then there'd be a 1 week, like a callback period for kids that needed it. You could run camps and stuff at the school if you wanted to, and then a week of vacation for everybody. And ski area went nuts when we brought that up. They were very upset. And a lot of parents said, they even said it started an organization called Save Our Summers, it's called SOS. I was getting all kinds of email from people saying I was trying to take away people's summers and stuff. So I'm not touching it again, but I think the General Assembly should. And you should chair the committee that does it.
We'll be the ones who save the summers.
I'm already doing an amendment on miscellaneous education bill.
It just makes sense. Our calendar right now is not based on anything that supports student learning. It is just not. People think it's an agrarian calendar based on farming and haying. It's not. It's based on New York City and Philadelphia and Boston having really hot summers, and the rich families wanted their kids to not have to go to school during those times because it had means. So they would travel to the country and to their summer homes in Hamptons and things like that. And so therefore they didn't have school during those months. And that's where the summer vacation concept came from.
Other questions?
Sorry, I went on a tangent. You know, this is an action of mine. Right?
No. We can talk about it for hours. Go ahead, Herb.
Yeah, hi, John. At one point, and I didn't quite catch the testimony that you have there, you're talking about an ideal situation. And you talked about CTE in high school.
Comprehensive high school.
Right, but were you talking about a facilities model that was ideal, or a governance model that was ideal?
Yes.
Both?
Yeah. I think it would be, you have a district, excuse me, smaller, fewer high schools. They're larger, and there's a CTE center that's part of that high school catchment area. And it's one facility or could be more than one building, but it's in one physical spot and everything is offered on that campus. That's the ideal.
Right, but to me, that's a facility model.
Yeah.
What about governance?
Governance, I would say you had 20 of those models, I would have 20 school districts. Elementary schools, students feed into it, a little bit bigger middle schools, may not necessarily close elementary schools, might close some that are really small, and they would feed into that one system.
No, just wanted that clarification.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Is that okay? Go ahead. Okay. Which we have somewhere around 30 high schools throughout
71.
71.
71 high schools, not counting,
Wikipedia is
private schools. Oh, I think last I counted it was 71.
So, and that's probably the case. Obviously, you know more than Wikipedia on that because that's what your job is. So if we were to look at that model, we could technically break it up into the current districts that we have right now.
We have 119 districts.
no, sorry, for CTE districts, I'm looking over.
CTE.
Which there's what, 15? Is there 15, 17, Jody?
Well, there's really 15 because two of them are attached to independent schools, right, Jody? So there's really 15 plus the two, St. Jay and Linden, right?
Yes, exactly.
I really like the idea of the comprehensive, and I think of, even if we didn't do a whole state model, doing the, the 15 districts and just let the CTEs take over the high schools, they could, within the next 5 years, try to figure out a way to combine the schools more, which would be an undertaking that I'm sure would be lots of fun.
Yeah, I think you'd have to take a strong look at that. I think there's some places on the map where that would make sense, other places where not. So
Yeah.
for example, where I was superintendent, that building probably should be knocked down, Cole Hall Career Center. Even for people who get emails tonight, but it's not, that building is not structured to give the needs that are there in those communities. So I think that would be probably too small of a district. We just left that alone if we're talking about a bigger scale, and the CTE center there's pretty small. So I think you'd want to be thoughtful about that. The other thing is you've got some SUs that are on the border of, some CTEs that are on the border of counties. So you gotta be thinking about the travel thing too. So I don't think it's gonna be quite that simple, but that is one thought that you could do, is you could try to line up with CTEs and have a number of districts, and each district has its own CTE. As long as you can make sure you get enough offerings for all the kids that are in that catchment area. That's one thought.
Their questions. So Jay, just that is what we're debating at this moment, right? What is the governance model? Is it a BOCES with whatever the new districts that are decided upon? Is it one single tech district for the state with multiple locations across the state? Is it a tech center for every new district that is decided, whatever that is, their own test? And what we're looking for is pros and cons. Why would this work better than something else? Which is the direction that would make the best sense for the state? Because everyone will have pinch points, frictions, problems that we will have to overcome. There isn't a perfect one, but having 4 different governance centers, they will all be better than.
I agree. I think having one system I don't think the system we have right now, there's no way we would have created on purpose what we have right now. What we have right now came over 200 and something years of evolution just with our regular public education system. And then the CTE is on top of that. I think that the CTE director's point about them being part of the governance model, though, is really important. We should be thinking out what's the best governance model that we can put forth, given the constraints that we have. And then how do the CTE centers best fit into whatever that new structure is? If you're going to have 5 systems, which, full disclosure, I think is one of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard, just being honest. If we went to 5 systems and one of those has 34,000 kids and goes from Shoreham to Richford, to me, it makes no sense at all. And if you were going to do that, then maybe you do just automatically go to one CTE center. But if you're going to end up with 20 or 25 districts or something along those lines, it might be a more nuanced way to build those CTE centers into these new governance structures where there really is that value and that sense of belonging and everybody's on the same page. And if they're all the same school district, don't do supervisor unions, please. But if they're all the same school district, where it's the same budgeting apparatus, the same superintendent, and it's all working towards the same end for the same people, then you have a lot more flexibility because the kids belong to that school district. And it happens to have a CTE center, and it happens to have a high school or 3 high schools or whatever it has. It's much more functional system. As the superintendent of that system, you can move employees around when you need to. And if you take care of the calendar issue, you can also start providing better professional learning for the CTE directors. The catch is going to be, if you go to a model like this, where they're inside the district, there's still going to be some issues around collective bargaining and stuff, which still would be easier to figure out in 20 districts than it is in 119, in terms of what do you pay teachers that are CTE teachers, because that's still a problem. It's hard to get somebody to leave their construction firm and take a $30,000 pay cut to work with the 17, 18-year-olds all day. I know as much fun as that sounds like, it is difficult to get people to do that.
We hope you'll stay engaged with us through the rest of this process.
Absolutely.
Chair, I think, no, Jody and Sue both said they'll come back in the morning.
Okay, that'd be great.
So I don't think there's enough time to bring anybody else up unless you do.
Well, there's always time.
Finish two.
Will.
There's great ice cream in the cafeteria. Okay.
Greg?
We all set? Okay, great.
Thank you.
So tomorrow, yeah, we'll hear from Sue and Jody and others. And continue our,
Chelsea.
yeah, Chelsea, and everyone that's on the schedule. So any questions, committee? Michael?
Am I the only one that's like digging the whole, like combining the high schools and CTE centers? Okay.
I mean, that seems like the gold standard. That would be like
Yeah.
the 20-year
Just-
goal.
We're just gonna send you out and find the dollar.
Yeah. Long-term vision.
It's- yeah.
The question is, what are the pros and cons to all of these different systems and which one works best
Exactly.
based on where we are now and what we want in the end?
Yeah.
And we don't know, I mean, the concepts, right? We have great concepts right now in 3 different areas. We don't know the detail on what it's going to take to change from what we have to those concepts. And like I said, what the pinch points are, and that's what we want the testimony.
What, just as if we're seriously considering the idea of combining techs with high schools, I think it would be really beneficial to have information on the high schools that are currently out there. Their geographic location, their current student body, which they're actually built for. So maybe they have 400 students, but technically when they were built, they were designed for 1,500. You know, because that's something that I know our district, our school was originally designed for like 1,800 kids. I almost think had at one point, how much, Jody, do you know what the high would be in Spalding High School? I think it was like,
I taught at Spalding High School starting in 1999, and there were 1,100 students at the high school side of it at that point. I don't
Yeah.
know how many were in the CTE center. I think fewer than 200.
but now we're down to like 400, and yet we don't have space. Right? So, and which is a whole different story. But I think-
Requirements change and.
Well, and maybe we need to modify our requirements. But I think having the asset side of things might be a good idea. Just for us to, as if we do consider that, because.
We're gonna hear from 4 different models. And we're gonna hear from CT directors of those 4 different models, and one of, so there are the comprehensives that are there as well. And yeah, I mean, everything's on the table right now. We're working to create something that'll work. Okay, so, I think if there's no other questions, we can go offline.